What's up everyone, Mr. Shivers here, and in this video I share a demo lesson I did with my AP Computer Science A class using CodeHS's Lesson 4.6 using text files. Exercise, we've got four different files here. 3 of them are text files that contain lyrics to songs, and then we have our main file with the main method, okay? So what we want to that reads one of these files and prints them to the console. So the assignment tab over here walks us through exactly how to do this, but I'm gonna skip this first step and you guys will see why at the end. First thing that we want to do if we're going to be reading from a file is we got to create a file object. This is just like we've done with scanners, strings, everything. We're going to create a variable that references a file object. So we can name this variable whatever we want. I'm just going to call mine file. And then we're going to call on the file constructor, and the file constructor takes in a single string, and that string is one of the names of the files that we want to read. Now, the only song that I'm familiar with is the Shake It Off one. So I'm just going to go with that file, and you guys can pick whichever one that you want to read. So once we have created our file object, we're going to create a scanner object. Now, we've already dealt with scanner objects before, and when we were using scanners before, we were reading user input, whatever they were typing into the keyboard, okay? So it's gonna be very similar to what we did before, but there's gonna be one slight change. So we're gonna create a scanner variable. I can call it input, scan, I call it whatever I want. I'm just gonna call this one scan equals new scanner. And the only difference between what we were doing before when we were getting user input and what we're doing now reading from files is we're going to pass in the file object that we just created. We're going to pass in the variable that's referencing this file object, okay? And what's happening here is that this file variable is referencing a file object which basically contains access to where this file is located. And what the scanner does is it gives us the ability to read from that file, okay? Now, this may not be the order that you write your programs in, but I suggest that you guys do this every single time when you're reading from files. Create our file object, we create our scanner to read the file, and at the very end, we're going to close our scanner. So we're gonna say scan.close, and this frees up the memory space. So once we say close here, we can no longer read from that file. If we wanted to open it back up, we'd have to reassign that scanner to a new scanner and pass in file again, okay? But this makes our code work a bit more efficiently, free some memory space. The nitty gritty of that is like outside the scope of this course, so we don't really need to go into that. So now that we've created all of this, we've closed the scanner, what we're gonna do is create a while loop. And within this while loop, inside the conditional, what we want to pass in is a method call to either hasNext or hasNextLine. So hasNext and hasNextLine are very similar methods of the scanner class, but we'll learn a little bit more about hasNext in later exercises. I'm gonna use hasNextLine here, and the reason why I'm gonna use this is because I'm gonna read the file one line at a time. But later on, we're gonna be able to read one token at a time because we can have a file that contains string data, double data, integer data, Boolean data, and we could grab one piece of data at a time, and that's when it would be more appropriate to use hasNext compared to hasNextLine. So since I'm reading the file one line at a time, that's why I'm using hasNextLine here, but you could still use hasNext if you want. I just feel like it's more appropriate to use hasNextLine, okay? So first thing that we wanna do is we wanna grab the data one line at a time. So we're gonna need to call on the scanner method next line, and this is gonna return the data as a string one line at a time, okay? So this is gonna return that, but just like before when we would get user input, we would create a variable to store that data in. So we're gonna do the exact same thing here. Since I'm getting string data, I need a string variable, and I'm just gonna call it line. So line is gonna store each line in the file. Then what we wanna do is we want to print that line. So if we print this line, it's gonna print what we just read from the file. So now I'm gonna try and click run here, and hopefully I didn't make any other syntax errors. Okay, so this is the error that I wanted to happen. So when we're reading from a file, in order for this to work, we have to implement this throws IO exception piece at the very beginning of our creation of our main function here. We have to put a throws IO exception. And basically you could think of this as like a protector of throws. You got to say S. Throws IO exception. And you could think of this as like a protection where just in case something went wrong with opening this file. Let's say you put the wrong file name, or for whatever reason, something went wrong in the trying to access the file. Our program will stop. Okay, so this is like an extra layer of protection that the compiler needs to make sure that everything runs smooth. Okay, so if I now click run, it will compile. And right now, the reason why it's taking a minute is because it's having to read the entire file. Okay, as you can see, all of the content that was all of the lyrics here that are in this file, Shake It Off, right? Starting off with I stay out too late, right? All the way down to I shake it off, right? It's gonna be all the way at the bottom. So everything is here. You can go line by line and check it yourself. But this is how we read data from a file. More specifically, how we read string data from a file, okay? All right, so let's get to the next one. All right, so this reading from files is completely new to the AP Comp Sci curriculum, at least in the last 4 years that I've been teaching this course. And looking at College Board, the creators of the curriculum, it's very surface level content for reading from a file, okay? So looking at the learning objectives and essential knowledge, this document that's provided by College Board, there's nothing in here about try and catch, okay? And we're gonna go over exactly what that is in a moment. I don't think that this is actually going to be covered on the AP exam, but the reason why I still wanna cover it is CodeHS, CS Awesome, and some other resources that I use for this course. They cover try and catch, but it's not covered in College Board on any of their multiple choice problems or anything. I didn't see anything in there. And then I even asked ChatGPT, hey, is try catch supposed to be in the new curriculum? And it was also saying that it didn't think so. Okay. So this could be outside the scope of this course. However, using try catch is going to be a lot better than using this throws IO exception. So as we just learned in the previous exercise, we have to put this throws IO exception in order for us to be able to read from a file. Okay. But there is an alternative thing that we can do, and that's using a try catch structure. Okay. And you can kind of think of this as almost like a if else statement. With try catch, we're going to try to execute what's inside the body of the try. But if something goes wrong, it jumps inside to the catch and then we execute what's in there. Let's see how this works. So what we have is we've got a couple files. We got a file called haiku.txt, and then we've got this read file runner, which contains the main method. And this is where our computer's reading these instructions. Okay. So let me clean this up here. What we see here is we have our main method, but notice there's no throws IO exception. Okay. I'm going to click run here. And what I want you to notice is that it works, right? So this is, like I said, an alternative to using the throws IO exception. Okay. So everything that we would have done before, create our file, create our scanner, close the scanner, create our while loop, read one line at a time, print it. This is everything that we would have done like we did in the previous exercise. Okay. There's nothing really new here except we implemented this try catch structure here, and then we no longer have to do the throws IO exception. Okay. Now, if I change this H to a capital H, there's no file called haiku.txt with a capital H. Okay. So when I go to click run here, you're going to notice this message gets printed, but I also want you to see that this isn't like a normal error. We're actually hitting a print statement here. So right here, an error occurs. We jump inside the catch body here. And what happens is if we go inside the catch body, this message gets printed. File not found plus e.getMessage. Now, e is a variable that we've declared in our catch. And the data type that E is an IO exception. Now, IO exceptions, understanding those are kind of outside the scope of this course, but you need this here in order to do your try catch. And only thing you need to understand right now is just that there is a method called getMessage inside the IO exception class. And in this case, let's see what it did. So remember, we printed this string literal here. file not found, colon with a space. This haiku.txt, no such file or directory, this is what's being provided by that method call to e.getMessage, okay? Let me show you what we get if I remove the try catch. So if I click run now, what you're gonna see is we're getting an error here, right? And this is that same error that we had before because we didn't have the throws IO exception. So throws IO exception. So now if I click run, notice we're getting an error here, and notice the same error message is here. You with me? Along with some other stuff here, okay? Now I want to show you one more thing. If I put a system.out.println made it, if I put this print statement here, let's see if that pops up when we run our program. Nope, no message was printed, right? So basically what happened was when we tried to do this thing right here, the program terminated, okay? An error occurred and the program terminated. So then let's go back to our original program. I'm gonna change this to H. So remember, this is what happened when we ran the program, yes? Now watch this. Outside of the catch, I'm gonna do system, oops, thought I had copied it. System.out.println, made it. So now notice, this message gets printed, the error message. So the error occurred, but we printed instead of terminating the program, okay? Now, if you guys are designing an app, do you want your app to crash when errors occur? Or do you want it to like a message to pop up or something saying, yo, that's not valid, or you're not able to do that, or, you know, by using this try catch, this is much more like you would do this instead of doing the throws IO exception, because you wouldn't want your program to terminate. You with me? So using this try catch, very, very useful, even though it may not be covered on the AP exam. I think it's still good for us to know. All right, so for this next exercise, we've got two files here. This investigate file, you guys are just gonna reflect on the explanation I'm about to provide you with right now. But we have a file called student names and a file called student names runner, which contains our main method. So this is where the computer's reading or getting its commands, and then this is a file that we're gonna be reading from. So whenever you guys are reading from a file, it's very, very important for you guys to understand how is the data structured inside that file, okay? So observing this file, we see that there are 50 lines, okay? 50 lines, and each line contains two names. Those two names, the first string is the first name of an individual, the second string is the last name of an individual, and then everything's being separated by a space, okay? Knowing all of this is very important, because when we start reading from the file, if we need to grab data one piece at a time, like say we only wanted the first names of the individuals, we'd have to know what's the structure of these, okay? So let's see what's going on in this main method here. So we imported everything that we needed to read from a file. We have our main method here, and notice there's no throws IO exception, but there's try and catch here. So because we're using try catch, we don't need a throws IO exception up here. The first thing that we do is we're creating a string array called a string array variable called students, and we're initializing it to be a default string array with 50 slots, or 50 elements can be stored, okay? Now looking at this file, there's 50 lines here, so we can kind of already assume, just knowing the structure of that data file, and just looking at line number 9 in the main method, is that each slot in our string array is going to store a line inside that data file, okay? So let's see what's going on here. So we have a try catch statement. We are printing a message if the file is not found, right? So if this doesn't match up with the file name over here. And then we have this call to a mystery method later. But inside our try catch, or inside our try structure, we create a file, We create a scanner, we pass in that file that we just created, and then we're creating a variable called index, and we're initializing it to be 0, and this is an integer type variable. Just seeing with what we've created so far, we can kind of already assume that this index variable is tracking the position that we're at in students. Okay, so we're gonna start at the beginning of students. That's the 0th position. And maybe we're gonna increment through to just access one slot at a time. So let's continue through. So remember, when you create your scanner, make sure that you close the scanner once you're done reading it. We create a while loop to read through it. Now, in our next couple exercises, we're going to talk about this has next. We used has next line in the previous exercise. And I think it would be still even more appropriate to use has next line here, but they're using has next, so we'll keep it there. But it works just like how a has next line is. We're reading through the file. Once we get to the end of the file, this is going to return false for us. So inside the while loop, we're grabbing the first and last name with the space in between on each line and storing it in name. Then we're accessing the indexed position of students and storing that name in that position. Then we increment index to move to the next slot. Okay, so we're reading through, we're grabbing all of the elements, we're getting all the names, we're storing them in the array. And then, assuming everything works, we don't have to go inside this catch body here. We call to this mystery method. This mystery method accepts our students string array and the string Maya, okay? So let's look at this mystery method. This is a void method. It takes in a string array and a string. What we do in this method is we're going to iterate through the array, starting at the beginning, going all the way to the end. How do we know? Because we're using an enhanced for loop here. Each element in the array is going to be referenced by this variable item. And then once item grabs one of those strings, we're going to check if item is storing null. If it's not storing null, we then check to see if the name parameter that we passed in, the string that we passed in, is within item. Now, we've been using index of to check if something is within something, but this is another string method that this simply just returns true or false. The index of returned the position of name in item, and then if it wasn't in there, it would return -1, right? But this simply just tells us, is it in there or not? So the reason why this first piece right here, item not equaling null, is super important is that we're calling on this method on item, right? If item is storing null, can you call a method on it? No, right? You cannot call a method on a variable, on a reference variable storing null. Okay, so that would throw an error. So from now on, it's probably good, and I'll probably put in a lot of the problems that I'm assessing you guys on, that we should be checking from now on that our reference variables are not storing null. Okay, so if they're storing null, we don't try to call this method here. But we see if that name is within that item. If it is, we print the variable name. Okay? Notice we're not printing item, we're printing name. So it's going to be printing the same thing that we passed in here each time. Okay? So I'll have you guys do the investigate piece, reflect on these questions, and then you have a modify part where we got to create this method called first name letter. For this next exercise, we've got two files here. We've got our file that has the main method, and then we have a file that contains a bunch of data. So we've got a bunch of soccer player names along with the country that they play for. So one thing to note about this data here is that we've got 30 lines of data, and we have a bunch of names, and then, as I said, the country that they play for comes after. But one thing to note is that not all of these lines contain the same number of strings. So like this one contains 3, 3, 2, 3. You go down here, we've got 5 strings here. So we're going to want to keep note of that if we're going to be reading from the file and trying to access specific data from the file. Okay. So if we're going to be reading from a file, remember that we have 2 options. We can use a try-catch statement, or we can use the throws IO exception. Since we're going to be using a try-catch structure here, there's going to be no need for us to use throws IO exception when we're creating this main method here. So let's create that array. So since we're going to be reading the file and then storing each line of that file in our array, we're going to be creating a string array here. And then in this exercise, we want to call this string array variable players. And then we're going to initialize it to have the number of positions or elements that is equivalent to the number of lines that we have. So we see down here, there's 30 lines. So we're going to be able to store 30 strings in this array. So what we want to do is we want to read through this file and grab each line and store it in the array. So we want to first make sure that we create our try-catch structure here. And in creating this try-catch structure, remember that for the catch, we're going to pass in, I'm going to call this variable E for error, and it's going to be of type IO exception. And then what we want to do inside the catch is we're just going to print some message, and I can just do e.get message. And then this is going to be like the actual error message that we get from the error that's occurring if something goes wrong in the try. Okay, so when we're trying to read from a file, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a file variable to reference a file object. So new file. So when we call on this file constructor, we got to pass in the name of the file that we're trying to read from. So we pass in this file name. Once we create that file object, we then need to create a scanner object. I'm just going to call this scan equals new scanner. And instead of passing in system.in when we were getting user input from the keyboard, we want to just pass in that file variable called file, which is referencing this file object. Okay, so this allows us to read from that file. At the very end of reading through the file, we want to make sure that we close the scanner. So scan.close, right? So now we just need to read through the file. What we're going to do is we're going to create a while loop, and inside the while condition, we're going to pass in this scan.hasNextLine. This is a Boolean method. It returns false the moment that we get to the end of the file and there's nothing else to be read. So what we want to do here is we're going to be reading one line at a time. So we're going to scan.nextLine. This method call here allows us to read the first line, and then the second line, and the third line, and the fourth line, right? And it returns that string on that line. Now we want to store this somewhere. I could create a dummy variable called string, initialize it, and then send that to my string array. But why don't we just send it to our string array? So players. Now we want to send it to a particular slot in our string array here. So we're going to be accessing a different position each step of the way. So we're going to need a variable to track at what position we're placing these things. So we need to create a variable, and I'm just going to create it up here. So int index equals 0, because we're going to start at the 0th position, and I'm going to put index in here. So now I'm accessing the indexed position and storing that line in the indexed position, and then we're going to increment index here. Okay. Now what's going to be important is that you have to be sure that you're lining up, like there's 30 lines here, okay? This has to match up with the number of elements that we're going to store in here, because if we end up having not enough slots, we're going to get an index out of bounds error here. So we got to make sure that we're paying attention to how many elements we're trying to grab from over here so that we don't get that index out of bounds error here. So once we read this file, grab each string and store it into the array, what we want to do is we're going to call on a method called country num players, okay? So we have to create this method. We're going to create this method and then we're going to call it. So we're going to make this a public method. It needs to be static because the only way that we can call on that method in the main method is that if it's static. And then this method is going to print each player who was born in a designated country and return the total number of players from that designated country. So because we're going to be returning something, we know this is going to be a non-void method. Now we're going to be printing the names of each player, but we're going to be returning the number of players that are from that country. So we're going to be returning an int, and then we got to put the method name. And this method is going to take in two values. It's going to take in an array of strings. So it's going to take in a string array. I'm just going to call this array ARR for array. And then it's also going to take in a string for the name of the country. So I'll say country name. So this method does a couple things here. Before we create this method, I'm going to go ahead and call it inside our main method. And we're going to pass in our array players. And let me just pick a name. Let's go Argentina. This method, if we just do this, it's going to print out all of the names, and then it's going to return the number of players, but it's not going to display the number of players from that country. So we need to also print this method call so that we can actually see. I mean, because it's printing every single player's name, we could count them all up if we wanted, but that would take away the purpose of this method being a non-void method here. So let's go through the process of what this method should do so that we don't get lost in the sauce, because we're going to be printing some stuff and returning something. So we do not get lost in the sauce. Let's just create a dummy variable called result that we're going to return at the very end, so we don't forget to return result. And result is going to be, actually, let's do count. Let's do count, and then we're going to return count at the very end. And count is going to be the number of players from that country, okay? So what we need to do here is we need to iterate through our array of strings. Now we can do this using an enhanced for loop or a traditional for loop. The fact that we are not changing the contents, like what's in the slots of the array, that's why I'm more inclined to use an enhanced for loop, just because the notation is a little bit cleaner, right? So let's create an enhanced for loop. An enhanced for loop only has two parts to it, and those two parts are separated by a colon. And the thing that we were going to iterate through is going to go on the right-hand side, so it's going to be our string array R, and then the data type of the elements that are in that array is strings, and then I'm just going to call it stir. So stir is going to store each string in the array. So what we want to do is we want to see if country name is in that string. So for example, the first iteration in this for loop, it's going to be Lionel Messi, Argentina. And it's going to contain all three of those strings, each separated by a space character, but it's all making one string, right? So we want to check if str dot contains, and we could either use contains or index of, right? But we use contains before. Actually, let's do an index of, just to get, because this is going to be on our Java quick reference guide, or sheet whenever we're taking the AP exam. So let's use index of. So str.index, if str.index of country name if this is not -1 or greater than or equal to 0, you could say either one of those things. I'm just going to say, oh, if this does not equal -1, then I want to print the name of the player. But I want to print the name of the player without the country in there. I just want to do either the first name or the first and last or all of the stuff except for the country name. And then let's also not include the space character here. You with me? So I'm going to create a variable here, and I'm going to make that variable be the position in stir where country name is. So I'm going to create int position equals this right here. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because I'm essentially going to need to do this thing again. And instead of me calling on this method twice, I can call it once and then just use this variable in here, because we're going to want to get a substring of this string here starting at, so index 0, and we want to go up to not including, not position, because position is going to be where that country starts, right? We want to go before that. So let's go position -1, okay? And then we're going to increment our count variable. Now, in our previous lesson, I mentioned that we got to start being careful when we are working with reference type variables, okay? Because reference type variables can store null. And if it stores null for whatever reason, let's say somehow it was reading the file and somehow one of the slots ended up receiving null for whatever reason, okay? Or maybe we skipped a slot, right? Because when we create this string array, it's a default array of strings, but they're all storing null, right? So let's say that we only had 29 names here. What would happen is the last position, the 29th position in this array, is going to be storing null. So when we go to do this here, we're going to end up with an error because we cannot call a method on a variable, because str is going to store null when it gets to the last element in that example, right? So let's make sure that we're protecting our program and trying to prevent these crashes from happening, okay? So how we can do that is, before we do any of this, let's just verify that str is not storing null. Let's make sure that it's not storing null, and then we will do this stuff, because we want to protect our program from crashing, okay? So now that we've completed this method, let's go ahead and run it and see. Hopefully I didn't do any syntax errors. Let's see if it runs. So we should be reading through the file, getting all the names, and what's my error here? Cannot find symbol, country, num. Why did I say country name? Let me copy. Country num players. Okay, now it should work. All right, so Argentina, I mean, we can go through here and make sure we've got 1, 2, and did I skip one? 1, 2, oh, 3, right? And then I don't see any others that are from Argentina, right? So it's just these 3 right here, and it was a total of 3. And what got printed after, because we're going inside this method, we're printing, and then at the very end, we're going to print the final output of this method, what it returns. So it's going to return that count value, which is 3, okay? All right, so for this next exercise, we've got 3 files here. We've got a file that we're going to answer some questions. We've got that Shake It Off lyrics file. And then we have a file called word count that contains the main method, okay? So Let's first take a look at our shake it off text file. Again, all of the text is one line at a time. There's 85 lines in here. So let's see what we're doing in the main method. Since we're gonna use a try catch structure here, we don't need to use throws IO exception on the main method header. So we do our try catch statement, and then inside the try, we start off by creating a file variable that references this file object, which is pointing to the shakeitoff.txt file. And then we create a scanner object so that we can read that file. Then we initialize a variable called numShakes to be 0. And then we have a string called target shake that we initialize to be this string literal shake. Then we create a while loop so we can iterate through the file. We're using hasNext here, but we could use hasNext line as well. But either hasNext or hasNext line could be our conditional for our while statement here. But we're grabbing one line at a time and we're storing it in this variable called line. We then create a string array called arrayLine, and we're initializing it to be line.split. Now, there are some new things that have been added to our reference guide. One of which is this split method, which this is a string method. Notice that we're calling it on a string variable. And what this method does is it returns an array where each element in that array is the tokens of that string. And how we know what makes a token is we put in what is called a delimiter. Delimiters are anything in a sequence that can be used to distinguish between parts of that sequence. So basically you can think of this as what we're passing in here is the thing that separates the data, one piece of data from another piece. Okay. So in this example, we're using a space. So every space character is separating an element. Okay. So we're initializing this arrayLine. We're assigning it an array that contains all the elements of that string line separated by a space. So there's going to be no spaces in our string array, but each element that's separated by a space is going to be in a position in our array. Okay. Then we're going to iterate through our string arrayLine, accessing each word at a time if word equals null. So remember that now that we're working with reference types, it's important that we make sure that our variables are not storing null. If they store null, you're going to get an error if you call a method on that variable. So we got to make sure that we don't get an error. So what we do is we check to make sure it's not storing null to make sure that we are able to actually call a method on it. So what we want to do is word is accessing each position in this string arrayLine. And we're saying, hey, is this word equivalent to target shake, which is this string literal here? If it is, we're going to increment numShakes here. Okay. And we go through this one line at a time, splitting that line into elements in an array. And then we iterate through that array, checking to see if it's equivalent to this string literal shake. If it is, we increment. And then at the very end, we end up printing the number of shakes here. Okay. And of course, we close our file whenever we're done reading from it. Now, one thing that I do want to note is that you see that we created our numShakes variable here. If I took this statement here, let me Command C. If I take this print statement and I just move this print statement outside of the try catch and I try and run this, an error is going to occur. Notice it says, hey, who is this variable numShakes? Remember that when we're creating our classes, our instance variables, we have access to them throughout the class, but it's because they're within the outermost set of braces. Okay? Because numShakes is declared inside this try statement, we only have access to this variable inside the body of the try. So then if I move the declaration of this variable to outside, notice it now works. So Just be careful when you're creating your variables. If you're only going to use those variables inside the try, you're good. But if you're going to use that variable outside of the try, make sure you at least declare it outside of the try body. All right, so in this next exercise, we've got 3 different files here. Our first file is the file that contains the main method. The second file are some questions that we gotta respond to. And then the third file here has some data contained in it and a few things that I want you guys to note. We've got different pieces of data here. Because there's no white space in between this data here, this is gonna have to be read as a string because there's this slash mark here, right? But the fact that we have this tab space here and an integer, a space, an integer, a space, or this looks like maybe 2 spaces, and an integer here, it doesn't matter what type of white space it is, next line, next double, next string, it's gonna ignore just the white space that's in here, okay? So let's go over to our main method. So in here, got our main method here. Notice there's no throws IO exception. So we're using a try catch statement here. Fine, right? If we didn't have our try catch structure there, we'd have to use the throws IO exception. So at the top up here, we have the num active days being declared here. And notice that we're printing the num active days over here. When we were creating our classes and we'd create methods or constructors and any variables that were created in a set of brackets, they only exist within that set of brackets. So the fact that we're trying to print num active days after the try catch is why we have to declare this variable outside of the try. Okay, but if we are only using this variable inside the brackets of this try, we wouldn't have to declare and initialize it here. Okay, so it needs to be created outside of these brackets in order for us to use it outside of those brackets. So like before, we create a file object and we passed in the name of the file that we want to read from. We create a scanner so that we get the ability to read from that file. And then now we're using this input.hasNext. And the reason why we're using this input.hasNext instead of input.hasNextLine is since we're reading the data 1 token at a time, it's going to be more appropriate for us to do this here. But notice what's happening here. We're grabbing a string. We're grabbing an int. We're grabbing an int. We're grabbing an int. If you look at the data, we're grabbing a string, grabbing an int, grabbing an int, grabbing an int. If we continue this pattern, once we get to the very, very end, right? Notice string, int, int, int. We could use hasNextLine, but I think it's more appropriate to use this hasNext because then it kind of indicates, like in my head, that, oh, I'm getting the data 1 token at a time. So if I click run here, we get all of the data. We're reading each of the data, right? And if we do hasNextLine, so let me just change this to hasNextLine, notice it still works, right? And it's because we're reading everything and then we're jumping to a new line. And of course, if we continue this pattern, if we check to see if there's a next line, it's equivalent to us being at the very, very end of the file. Okay, but like I said, I think it's more appropriate to use this hasNext here. So what we do is we grab the date, lightly activity data, fairly active data, very active data, and then what we do is in order to be considered an active minute, it must be either fairly active or very active. So lightly active does not count as an active minute, okay? So we're gonna print the date, the number of active minutes, and this message saying, oh, there's this many active minutes. And then we check if active minutes is greater than or equal to 30 and increment the number of active days by 1. So we're tracking also how many active days there were. So we're like tallying up the number of active days within all of these days. Now, if I triple click on this lightly active variable here, notice that throughout my code, it's not used anywhere else. So the fact that this variable is not used anywhere else, do I have to have this line? Can I delete this line? No, right? Look at the data here. If we say, hey, read string, read int, right? So next line, next int. There's still more data, so this is going to return true. So then we're going to read this as a string, and then we're going to try and read this entire thing as an int. Are you with me? So we're going to end up with an incompatible types error if we don't have this line of code here.